Hi, everyone. Welcome to 2022 State of Data Practice. We're excited to share results of a survey of 300 data practitioners that we fielded along with the Center for Generational Kinetics. We're hitting the highlights today, and the full report is going to be available for download later this month on our website, and we look forward to sharing that with you. There is a question queue. It's labeled Q&A. It's not the chat. So if you'd like to ask us questions, please drop them there. To minimize the disruption, we're going to save those for the end. And if we don't get to your question during the session today, then we will follow up with you. So I'm Erica Fowler, and I am a senior product marketing manager at Molecula. I have about 14 years experience in data and analytics. I have a PhD in epidemiology, where I discovered my love of analytics and then worked across multiple industries in healthcare and banking, and have now found my way to Molecula in the technology development space. And I'm here with my colleague, Greg.
Hi there, I'm Greg Throne. I'm a technical product manager at Molecula. Previously, I worked as a data engineer working on traditional BI solutions, as well as a machine learning engineer working on model pipelines, data pipelines that feed models and similar work. And I've been in the space for about 8 years now, so really excited to go through this with you today.
Me too. All right, so for our agenda, we're going to start off with a basic overview of our 300 respondents, and then we'll dive into implications that we drew from the respondents' self-reported challenges with AI ML implementation. And we're going to talk a little bit about how those challenges impact data practitioners on their day-to-day responsibilities. And then we're going to wrap up with that Q&A. Remember to drop those questions in the question queue, and we will get to as many as we can during the session. If we don't get to you today, we will follow up. Before we get started, we wanted to introduce you to our company, Molecula, and to our partner in this survey, the Center for Generational Kinetics. So Molecula closes the gap between data and decision, enabling organizations to unlock the power of real-time analytics and AI. By eliminating resource-intensive preaggregation, Molecula accelerates data-driven business outcomes. And CGK, our partner, is the #1 firm for generational research, strategy, and keynote speaking. If you haven't heard their president, Jason Dorsey, speak, check him out on LinkedIn. He's a phenomenal speaker and does some really fun presentations. If generational research is relevant to your business, or if you're just interested in it, CGK is the first place to look. And with that, we're going to jump into our overview of data practitioners, just to give you an idea of who we heard from in our survey. We fielded a 20-question survey with currently employed data practitioners, data engineers, and data scientists aged 22 to 65 to make sure that we got people that were solidly in the workforce. We had a good distribution of ages and a good distribution across the United States. And one thing that we were pleasantly surprised to see is that we had a nice percentage of women answer the survey. So roughly 27% of people that are in STEM careers are women, and we had about 35% women in our survey. So that was really exciting to see. Similarly, we got good distributions across other demographics like level of responsibility, company size, household income, and the number of members that are on the current data team. We, over-indexed a little bit on the managers and the employees, but we were happy to see that. We were able to hear from people that really have their hands on the keyboard and are in the thick of implementing AI and ML projects. But we also were able to hear from leadership, having some CEO and VP and director level roles represented as well. Greg, anything here that strikes you as interesting?
No, I picked up on kind of the same. I mean, that looked like a higher management percent, but in all honesty, I'm kind of excited to hear voices from a bunch of different roles across an org. So that's really cool, and just seeing a nice distribution throughout the other graphics looks really good to me.
Awesome. One analytic note that we want to touch on before we keep going is how we organized our job titles that we use to screen people to take the survey into a couple of groups to help us get through the analytics of this and make some sense of it. So We looked at 33 different job titles that people were able to select to be screened into the survey, and we collapsed those into two categories: engineering and analytics and data science. Initially, we wanted to pull data science out as its own discipline, but we only got about 25 respondents that were data scientists, so they were rolled into the analytics group. You're going to see these themes repeated throughout, so just wanted to kind of give everyone an idea of what makes up these groups. And now for the good stuff, we're going to jump into the challenges that are impacting successful implementation of AI ML projects in these data practitioners organizations. So first, data practitioners overwhelmingly agree that their organization is effectively using data. This is really exciting for me to hear, being in the space for so long. These beliefs were consistent across every cut of the data that we looked at. And it's really awesome to see that the promise of data or big data is really finally paying off in a way that people are able to talk about positively. So, you know, data driven, it's not just a buzzword anymore. Organizations are well on their way to delivering on those promises. Greg, what do you think seeing this?
Well, that first point around investment just makes sense, right? We all see how much money is going into data, I think, from just about any role in the org. The using your data effectively is really interesting, because I think if we look back, anyone in their organization 10 years, it's easy to say, yeah, we're using our data so well. But if I think about us in 10 years time and looking back at where we are today, that is going to be a much lower percentage. So I think that's really interesting. I think it's true relatively, but I still think to use data effectively is going to have a much larger, I guess, definition in the future than we think about it today.
Absolutely. Like, you know, investment starting to pay off, but could your data be doing more? It absolutely could. So we also asked each data practitioner what stage of AI ML implementation that their organization was in. And we found that organizations in the early stage are evaluating business cases, starting to build models, and they're working towards putting them into production, but they're not quite there yet. So we call these early stage companies. And then we broke out established companies that have models in production from 1 to 5 years. And we broke them out this way because their goals and their challenges are likely a lot different. And we wanted to see how their responses reflected those differences. And you're going to see this breakout in addition to the analysts and engineers throughout the rest of the webinar.
Yeah,
Greg, anything? Oh, sorry.
No, I like the breakouts that you have here. I think it's reflective too. We kind of see AI and ML everywhere, but companies outside of FANG are really still pretty young in that space. So I think that's pretty accurate when you look at the 2.3% for 5+ years. That's definitely in line with what I'd imagine. But I want to go back and think about that last slide, right? We said 96% of us or something like that think we're using our data effectively. Yeah, right. Yet only 38% we have in this established bucket. And I just want to touch on that, right? Speaking of how to use data effectively, I think there's so much space to grow. So just interesting to see that.
Absolutely. And we're definitely going to talk about why why this is in the rest of our session today. So another one of the overarching concepts that we wanted to understand was around decision-making and influence regarding architectural changes in an organization. So we first asked who in your organization has the most significant influence when it comes to making changes to your tech stack. And then we found, you can follow along on the x-axis here, that most often the most influential person was someone in the C-suite, the CDO, the CTO, the CIO, or maybe the principal data architect, or even the CEO. But about 5 to 20% of the time, it was a data engineer, a data scientist, or a data analyst. We then asked them who in your organization has significant influence when it comes to making these changes. but they're not recognized for having that influence. And overwhelmingly, that was the data engineer, the data analyst, or the data scientist. Data practitioners that are most likely to have, like I said, their hands on the keyboard were the most likely to have influence but not be recognized for that. And then on top of that, we found a fun stat that was 41% of data practitioners say that engineers, the most unrecognized group, are more important than the CEO. So maybe they should be recognized for their influence. Greg, does that resonate with you as a data engineer?
It shouldn't, but yes. No, but I mean, this graphic certainly does. Previously, if we were looking at bringing on new tech, it was the business owners and architects would create tiger teams of essentially those three roles to evaluate the tool and actually play with it. Because at the end of the day, those are the end users for the most part. And whatever the, I guess, overlying value that tool is going to give the business, if the end users don't like it or don't like how it's used, it's really hard for me to think about how that value is ever going to be extracted. So makes complete sense, and this is really what I experienced when I was in these roles.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like we've had pretty similar experience in that area. A lot of times, if companies are coming in with some new technology and they're promising all of these amazing things that they can do, and leadership's nodding their head, I'm over in the corner like kind of scared because I'm the one going to have to deliver on all of those promises. So definitely resonated with me as well. All right, those are some overarching kind of themes we wanted to talk about, and now we're going to really dive into these challenges. So we asked, we're trying to figure out like why is this so hard? Why is this implementation hard? And one of the things we wanted to know is how much time would it take in your organization today to get an AI/ML project from an idea to production? And you see that 40% say 7 to 9 months, which is the largest group, and then the next largest group was 10 to 12 months. So this really confirms, 7 to 9 months is a pretty good estimate. We hear this number a lot, but here it's confirmed. And I've read, it may take anywhere from 3 to 36 months, depending on the complexity of the project. So Greg, how did you feel about this timelines?
Well, in all honesty, I feel like I was in the, 6 to 9 bucket range. So it's spot on. And I mean, if you try to add up those bars, something like 70%, right, are around 6 or 7 months or more, which is just huge. I mean, it just speaks to how long something like a model takes to get into production, which is a little bit crazy considering how fast we can do other things today. So yeah, I completely agree with this, and it's nice to see others had just as long timelines as I did.
Definitely. All right, so why is AI/ML so hard? You'll see this repeated throughout the presentation that, the distributions are pretty flat across a lot of what we looked at, which tells us that despite a few standouts issues that we found, everyone's facing different challenges across the full implementation lifecycle for AI/ML. So, the production process, data wrangling, and feature engineering are all at the top of the list. So really quickly, I want to talk to you about kind of how to read the graphs that we're going to go through today. So we asked people, what were the top reasons, and we asked them to select 3. So this dark blue bar here is the percentage of time that this was selected as the very top reason. And then the teal bars are showing when it was selected somewhere in the top 3. So for example, making changes to updates to an established production model, 14% of the time this was selected as the #1 reason, and 38% of the time it showed up in the top 3 reasons. And I mentioned flat distributions. You can see there's really not anything that really pops out as a huge problem relative to the other ones. It's just kind of all hard, and it's hard for different people in different parts. And this is all ML ops. It's no wonder that we've seen such an explosion of ML ops technologies come into the market. The really successful ones are spinning out of big tech companies that were trying to solve some really big problem, and then that problem got big enough to be a potential revenue generating business unit on its own and started spinning out technologies. So So with that, let's talk a little bit more about the #1 top rated and top 3 rated challenge, making changes or updates to an established production model. That was the highest ranking across the board at 14%, but CEOs were particularly concerned. And I thought this was really interesting. They chose it as the #1 challenge 20% of the time, which was far more than any of the other technologies. So Greg, like, why do you think this #1 challenge for data practitioners in general and then for their CEOs, why do you think this one was the one that rose to the top?
Well, it's interesting that CEOs did that. I'm not sure I can explain that on the top of my head. I will say that would have been the #1 pick for me, because touching a model that's already implemented is the scariest process ever, because it's something that works, it's embedded in the business process already, and any sort of variation on that can completely kill that value and start impacting customers. So any of those changes always terrified me. And I think if you look at the 4th, it says production process. I think that, and that's a pretty highly rated top 3 answer. I think that touches kind of why is that process is generally crazy and long and leads to that 6 to 12 month timeline we saw up above. So there's no standardized process around this across the industry. I think it's different for any org, and it tends to be really complex. But touching a model, right, essentially you're going to have to go through all those gates, whatever you set up. And from my experience, that's not only retraining the model, which risks introducing new biases, having to get new historical data that, again, we don't know how the performance is going to be on production data, and then a legal and compliance review and the actual push of the implementation and not interrupting service. So there's just tons of touch points that make touching that implemented model so scary, and I've seen it really blow up. So I am still terrified to this day of that process.
Definitely. I think that sounds like something a CEO would be concerned about. So maybe it's not so surprising that they are concerned. It sounds kind of terrifying across the board.
Yeah, maybe it's all of us complaining about how scared we are and that just kind of going up.
So, mentioning those flat distributions and how everyone kind of seems to have a different challenge, we asked them what part of, if you could change one part of your organization's tech stack, what would it be? Again, we got answers all across the board. Organizations all have different goals, they have different data, different problems they're trying to solve, and there's no silver bullet. These tech stacks are as unique as the problems that they're trying to solve, and there isn't just one tool that will rule them all, so to speak. So, Greg, did this surprise you, like in your career? What's the part that's given you the most heartache?
It doesn't surprise me, especially that it's, somewhat even distribution. I feel like I'd love for all these to be better. If I think about, we have kind of early adopters and are established, then this sort of makes sense, because we had less established companies where something like orchestration and metadata capture, I think that becomes more and more relevant the more experience you have in that space, whereas something like ingestion and deployment is something upfront when you're an early adopter and just getting into this. If I had to pick, it would certainly be something around metadata, because I did so much repetitive work of capturing model inputs and responses, and I guess monitoring as well, because every model is different, but that the process of capturing that information is really repetitive and isn't quite able to be kind of automated because of that. So those are definitely my 2 biggies.
Definitely. Metadata and getting people to understand what it is and why it's important if they haven't worked with data has been one of the hardest things I've come across as an analytics professional. So I can definitely resonate with that. Okay, so one of my favorite phrases is that AI ML, or really anything data related, it's not magic. It probably seems like it to people that aren't in the weeds, but successful analytics, and especially AI/ML projects are, the product of years of expertise. And as you can see from our discussion today, it's really hard and it can take a really long time if you ever get there at all. So here we see yet another flat distribution that identifies reasons that projects don't meet business needs. So subpar model performance, resources needed to run the model, outweighing the perceived benefits of it, and then architecture challenges, and then unrealistic expectations of the business for what the model was going to do. They all rose kind of to the top together. Over half of data practitioners said that AI/ML is attempted when a less complex method would have been enough. A couple of these really resonate with me, but Greg, I want to hear from you first.
Yeah, I think all these resonate with me. My 5 years implementing models, I think the only one I can say that I haven't come across is our models always meet business needs. I don't know who those individuals are, but I'm pretty envious of them. But yeah, I've seen them all, and I have some examples of these, right? But so the model doesn't fit within the business process is, I don't know, kind of a classic tale in the ML space, but it's so important to really vet a model within your business process before you work on it. We have kind of, I'd say, potential value and perceived value when we first ideate on a model and what it could do, but there's a lot of work that has to go into actually validating that model fits within the process and can deliver on that value. And I've seen tons of times where we don't think about, kind of agency theory concerns or where the model is being consumed, where it just won't actually work within the business process, even if the model performs, as we expect it to. I'd say, let's see, the using a model implementation maybe wasn't sort of the best solution. I think we really get caught up in using AI and ML just because of the buzz around it, when really simple business rules could have sufficed. And we should never be in a state where we're throwing models at everything just because we can. There are times when, especially if you have a model that's kind of interpretable by humans, you can see like some really easy results that we could have done with simple business logic or a quick if-else script. So I'd always say consider that aspect as well before kind of diving into an AR like an ML project. But I'm curious on your experience.
Yeah, I think the unrealistic business expectations, I think, a lot of times I'm in the room trying to come up with a strategy around what we're doing, and it's a lot of people that aren't the people with their hands on the keyboard. It's a lot of leadership, and this is an expensive project. We're trying to find the tools that we need, and they really want this to work, and maybe it's part of their personal goals or the organizational goals to become data driven, and everybody wants to do it overnight. So similar to some of what you're saying, sometimes a model is thrown at a problem that doesn't really need a model, or you mentioned not fitting into the business process. Like maybe you have this, there's one project I worked on where there was like this AI pricing model where we wanted to update pricing automatically, but our systems didn't talk to each other, and there was a literal like human step in the way where you had to upload a CSV file into the system. That was the only way you could do it. So we had this whole process built out and spent hundreds of thousands of dollars building it, and in the end we couldn't even do it. So it was it was, yeah, just having, and we touched on this in another one of our webinars, like 5 keys to getting a positive ROI on your AI projects, and this is one of them. Make sure you have all those stakeholders in the room and understand like who's doing what and how this is going to fit into that bigger process. Like if we'd had the right people in the room, we might have realized that this person had to physically upload this file, and we couldn't do what we were trying to do.
Yeah, that's super funny, and I've definitely seen that before, and maybe a rule of thumb for everyone listening, but anything model related, always make sure that those sources, I guess, are maybe IT approved is the right word, but have automation around them, because that stuff.
You end up
It's
making
awesome.
more work for yourself.
Right,
So,
exactly.
now that we've covered this overall view, we wanted to point out some interesting trends we saw with early stage and established companies. So remember, we defined early stage as not having models in production, and it's not really related to the actual age of the company. Similarly, established means that they have models in production for a year or more. It doesn't really have anything to do with how long they've been around. So we found that early stage companies are more focused on budget or legal issues, or getting the production environment ready to support those models. And established companies were more concerned about making changes to established models and the risk that comes with that, data wrangling, the overall production process. And they also struggled with the business expectations that were unrealistic. So this makes sense to me. They all really hit home, but none more than that, the unrealistic business expectations, as we mentioned before. People think that, in addition to what we talked about, sometimes people think that one model is going to solve like 7 or 8 different problems. And it's like, no, this model is going to have like an outcome, and then you're going to use that information to make decisions. Like the smart people in your organization are going to take what the model gives you, and they're going to, wrap their knowledge around that to help, drive the business outcomes. It's not going to just like do something on its own. So Greg, is there anything we haven't touched on that really resonated with you, or any ideas that, could shed some light on why these were the problems that they had?
No, I think you nailed it. Really, that difference of like if your models are in prod or not. I think again, it just points out there's going to be challenges to overcome in the early stage and the established stage. There's ML brings a suite of challenges that everyone's going to have to overcome. So nailed it.
Awesome. One other point before we move on, I don't want to lose. A lot of people I've talked to about these results as we've been preparing for this webinar are really surprised by the legal process popping out as a significant issue. And I just wanted to say, like, as a practitioner, the legal process can really be a hindrance, especially when you're just starting out as an organization, or, doing some of these bigger data-driven projects. So projects can be delayed or modified so significantly that they don't even resemble what you set out to do. Like maybe your tech isn't secure enough. Maybe you don't have the right permissions to use the data that you have. Maybe a process needs to shift, or somebody needs some kind of certification. So even if you're, not somebody that you would think would be worried about a legal process, it might be impacting your day to day. So I just wanted to call that out before we move on to the next one. All right, so we looked at early stage and established companies. Now we want to just see kind of what engineers versus analysts look at. So Greg, what is your take on this? Does this ring true?
Yeah, let me take a peek at these.
Like engineers, they typically struggled with like the production process, and then analysts struggled with the task to kind of ever get there in the first place.
Yeah, and I think I'll kind of go a step further and really say it looks like to me, at least from the engineering perspective, it's what are the things that are going to generate calls for me in the middle of the night, or what's going to trigger an alarm to my manager that comes down to me. And that's again a lot of stuff that's in production. Of what I'm seeing is gonna hurt me at the end of the day. Making changes, again, I've already talked about that being the biggest one. Too resource intensive, potentially crashing nodes. Our data can't support because something upstream happens. It doesn't actually fit the model implementation at the end of the day. We didn't support what the training environment set out, the training data set set out to do. So I'm in complete agreement. And from the analyst perspective, that makes sense, because I think that role was generally coming to me and saying, why isn't my model in production? And it's me basically outlining the majority of those details, right? Our production process takes too long, or legal and compliance shut down the model. So for me, it's passing on the bad news. So for them, it's obviously a huge pain point, and data wrangling is a piece that they're actually doing their hands on. So this all makes a lot of sense to me. But as the bearer of bad news for analysts, I can see why saying it takes a 6-month plus process to implement could trigger some anger there.
Well, maybe if, maybe if we didn't, do all the laptop data scientists and, have all this training data that you couldn't put into production, maybe that maybe we could come to a happy medium there.
In the perfect world.
All right, so kind of what we gathered from this is, it comes as no surprise that automation of repetitive tasks is something that data practitioners want. We asked, if this is like a group of a couple of different questions, but would it make your job easier if these things were automated, or how do you feel about automating these processes? And overwhelmingly, feature engineering, data wrangling, repeatable model frameworks, and repeatable data pipelines for models were overwhelmingly, yes, we want these automated. Timeline's already long, the process is complex, so offloading any part of that process to an automation job would undoubtedly help. Greg, I know you've mentioned automation a couple of times, so what do you think about this?
I think the only thing I can add is I'm surprised even it's not even that low, but model frameworks and data pipelines, that percentage isn't even higher. But I think over time it will be. And again, it kind of sort of reflects, right, our number of early stage versus established companies. So as they move from one bucket to another, I bet that percentage moves up right along with it.
I couldn't agree with you more. So that takes us to our next section. We're going to talk about the impact that all of these challenges have on the day-to-day lives of our data practitioners. So, we know this by now. We've seen it a bunch of times. Production's really, really painful. So once again, the pain is seen throughout the entire MLOps process. So we asked which of the tasks below cause the most difficulty in completing your day-to-day responsibilities at your organization. And data issues, which are latency issues, consumption issues, those were the one most likely to be selected as top 3. And then model maintenance, which I know, Greg, we've talked about a lot today. Making changes to established models and maintaining those is the number one task that rose up here. One of my passions is data governance, and I'm not surprised to see that one near the top. Everybody's heard garbage in, garbage out, so I wasn't really surprised to see data governance come up really high up here either. Anything that was interesting here for you?
Yeah, I mean, data issues for me, I mean, it's only 10%, but I think it's the highest from a top 3 perspective. And that makes sense because data issues kind of affect almost everything an analyst, data engineer will touch. But I think that bleeds right even into model maintenance. So we talked about, changing an established model is scary, but if that's not happening, the majority of my time as a data engineer was fixing models from data issues. And that can mean a slew of things, but it's so easy for upstream data to change. Something is labeled differently, or we start, handling a bunch of new data that's coming in null. And what's really scary is sometimes, models will spit out errors and you can go in and fix that. But there's a lot of times when they don't. They're still, they have rules built in that they're just, either ignoring those records or now scoring them differently. And that's when you can get into a lot of trouble because you go on, inferencing for months and not realize that performance has been affected until way later down the line. So for me, that is kind of the scariest. And I think it's an interesting area that is really difficult, but making models more resilient to data issues upstream is something I'm really interested in, and seeing how that kind of develops over time.
Awesome. Yeah, that is going to be really interesting, and those are all big problems. The monitor, I'm just thinking of I don't know, I was just having like remembering traumatic experiences in my head as you were talking related to that. So another thing that we wanted to talk about are like, what kind of workarounds are you doing, or how often are you doing workarounds? So, really finding workarounds is part of the job. 69% of data practitioners use workarounds always or often, And the most troublesome workarounds, again, were kind of all across the board. This one was like really, really flat. But you know, production's hard pretty much across the board, as we've talked about. One of the most interesting findings for us here at Molecula is that data pre-aggregation was not really seen as a workaround that contributed to technical debt. So this was which workarounds caused the most technical debt. And data pre-aggregation, it didn't make it up there. So we'll get into this a little bit more, but just want to kind of get your opinion on this before we dive in a little bit more.
Yeah, I to be honest, again, I've done most of these workarounds at some point, but I wouldn't have considered data pre-aggregation a workaround. That in my mind that's kind of just a step that I'm sort of used to, right? And that's modeling or traditional BI. You're trying to find, well, at what grain of data am I, trying to build for this solution? And that the assumption is it's always sort of pre-agged in steps before, or I'm going to have to pre-ag in some way my data before my solution, be it model or report or something else, has to happen. So I got to say I relate, because I never really think about that as technical debt.
I didn't until I got here. So kind of like you mentioned, pre-ag is a way of life. It's so common, data practitioners don't rank it highly, as we mentioned. One of the things that excites me most about, Molecula is that we can eliminate this, and, we can talk about that at a later time. But we asked data practitioners, if your organization's data did not have to be pre-aggregated, how much time would you save getting from an idea to production at your organization? And, despite the fact that this isn't really seen as a workaround, it's a way of life, 46% could save 1 to 3 months, and another 27% 4 to 6 months. So that's a lot of time that could be saved on the production process, being able to work with data that was in its kind of most granular state. And then 68% of data practitioners prefer working with data that's not pre-aggregated. Being limited to that pre-aggregated data has been one of the top struggles I faced as a data practitioner. What about you, Greg?
Yeah, and I sort of mentioned it before, but I never considered that a problem, and Molecula is kind of changing my mind about that. But I was in the 1 to 3 month camp, because if I had to create new tables, and if you're at a company with a lot of, I guess, red tape, we'll say, right, creating a table and going to a DBA and that whole process, that takes a ton of time. So it really did take me more months if I had to create a whole new level of pre-aggregation for a solution. And the graphic that says 68% prefer working with data that's not pre-agged, I can agree with that a lot. I've never worked with a system that was fast enough to do these things. So I guess one example I have is, excuse me, we had a marketing like attribution system where, you'd aggregate all your campaigns for like email and TV and phone calls. But those all had to be pre-aggregated, and then you had to kind of aggregate all of them together, and then you had to unify all the numbers. So if I was ever trying to investigate an issue with data, or even, just get down to like one individual record, I generally have to start from the top of what's going on with all this pre-ag data, work my way down and down and down. So that's a lengthy process. And then by the time I'm trying to perform these aggregates on the raw data, I'd be spending for hours. I'd be sitting there. So such a painful process. And I'd love to work with non-aggregated and raw data, but the time of like sitting there for those queries just wasn't really realistic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know we've talked about this a lot too, like when you have the, pre-aggregated data that's like running your reports and, looking at a dashboard, you can spot like something's wrong pretty quickly, but to really dig into the details and understand why that's happening, like you really often have to go beyond what that dashboard says or what's in that pre-aggregated data and go back to the source. And that can be a really lengthy process. So I can relate to all of what you said there. All right, so this one was really interesting. I don't know about you, but this one is really near and dear to my heart. So 61%, well over half of data practitioners say that engineering and data science are converging as career paths, but I don't really think that's happening. I think that data scientists and data engineers are expected to know more or to know everything. You know, organizations are tasked with doing more with less every year, even though investment in data analytics, AI, ML is growing. You know, there's still this you know, just economic idea of doing more with less. So organizations are really like looking for those unicorns or those magical employees that, you know, are full stack this, and they can not only, you know, build the models, but they can also put them in production, and they can also present all the results up to the CEO. And like finding one person that can really do that can be really difficult. And you know, I was on an industry panel for Ohio State. They're, you know, developing a new graduate program that was more kind of technical and hands-on. And companies across Columbus or Central Ohio gathered and talked about what would we want someone coming out of that degree to be able to do. And all around the room, it was full stack. We want them to not only understand the model and the business, but know how to put it in a container and like do all of the things. So, you know, yeah, I think that this is more a symptom of, you know, organizations are just expecting more. So off my soapbox, Greg, it's your turn. What do you think about this?
It's interesting. Also, I assume that's a unicorn for the data engine. I don't know what to call it. Not an analyst, not an engineer, but I guess the data unicorn. It's interesting when I think of like full stack in the traditional software development sense. Like, no, that'll never happen. In this like data science, data engineering path, I kind of do see that convergence from at least from the perspective that it just makes sense to me. So we talked about before where the data engineer say, hey, your model is not going into production for 6 months, and you know, other blockers. So like the data scientists make sense. I want to get my model into production, and if you're not going to do it, then I want to do it. So I see that role growing more and more into implementation. And then from my perspective, like I did a ton of training and learning on the machine learning space because I was tired of receiving pickle files or models rather, right, that essentially broke and woke me up in the middle of the night, or I didn't understand. And so it's in my best interest to grow more and more in that space and be able to develop my own models so I don't have to wait on, you know, the data scientists for that, and I actually understand, you know, the coefficients and inputs going in before I try to implement it. So I think the convergence makes sense. I think it'll take time, but I do think it will be a nice unity to have those two roles sort of as one and working together.
Yeah, I definitely think like easier collaboration would be nice. I know a lot of, like, sometimes, not a lot, but sometimes there's friction because maybe an engineer isn't as close to the business, and so I'm asking for things that don't make sense, like they're not efficient, or like they're like, I don't understand why you'd want to do it that way, but there's like a really specific business reason that you would need to. So definitely, and then I couldn't implement a model on my own to save my life, so that would probably be you know, really beneficial for, you know, both sides to kind of level up and understand each other more to be more efficient. And then with a lot of the tooling coming out, hopefully that, you know, can bridge some other gaps, some of these new MLOps platforms. All right, so next, key takeaways. So kind of, you know, data practitioners, what do they want? They want trust and appreciation. They want to be heard in the organization. They want to be recognized for that influence. They want better tools to work with. They want to do the jobs that they're hired for, not repetitive tasks that could be automated. They want to collaborate with larger teams. The stat didn't make it into any of the slides, but the majority said that they wanted more engineers and more data scientists on their teams. So these are some of the key takeaways that we found from the section on the impacts to the day-to-day lives of data practitioners. And where to go next? So, you know, organizations, they're more aligned than ever. But they're struggling to identify the right tools to support production, or maybe the right processes to go after Data wrangling tasks, especially pre-aggregation, those are underlying problems that limit the implementation of AI/ML, and they have a negative impact on data practitioners' job satisfaction. So, you know, often these tasks didn't rise all the way to the top, but they were ranked top 3, or maybe they weren't seen as workarounds that cause technical debt, but they are these underlying problems that are causing the production process to be more difficult than it has to be. And where do we want to go next here? So, you know, align the AI/ML strategy with your organization's needs and their capabilities to make sure you're maximizing that investment and not wasting time or resources on something that you can't actually put into production or doesn't work with your business process. And prioritize those underlying issues like pre-aggregation, and simplify your data stack when you can to reduce friction and risk when updates or changes are needed to those production models. Greg, anything else you want to add before we jump into Q&A?
No, just it was a lot of fun to go through the data with you. I think it's nice to see that others out there kind of relate with the same pain points that I had. You know, kind of leaving my sort of job in that space, it's really hard to understand how, if that's isolated or that's throughout the whole industry. So it's just really nice to see these numbers. And I think the underlying, I don't know, current of all this is we're all looking for more value and a faster path to it. And I can say, like, the most rewarding experience as like machine learning engineer was delivering a model that works and works as intended and creates that value. So I'm just happy to, you know, keep working on solutions that help us get there faster. So thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. This was a lot of fun, and I share the same sentiment. You know, one of the reasons I joined Molecula is that I'm kind of on the other side of the table now. I have spent so many years like struggling with data and analytics and getting the data in the right formats and, you know, the pre-aggregation and all of that stuff. And now I feel like I'm helping, you know, from a bigger role to push analysts and make this easier for them so that they don't have to go through all those struggles. So it's been a really nice shift for me coming from a data practitioner now to a product marketing manager. All right, let's see what questions we have. Let's see. This said, making changes to an established production model. Like, what does that mean? So we talked about this quite a bit, but Greg, can you maybe give an overview again of kind of what that means, like making changes to an established production model?
Yeah, and it ends up meaning a lot, but I'll say the underlying piece of that generally means that you're going to be retraining the model, and whether that's to handle, you know, new inputs, or you're just refreshing it because the data it was trained on was, you know, 3 years ago, and that doesn't really reflect the data of the current, the data that's currently coming in is kind of the driving force behind that. But then that actually means changing a lot of different components. So if you add inputs, right, you got to at least modify the data pipelines you created to feed those models to include that data. You got to make sure the timing of everything is right there. You're going to have data scientists retraining that model, but you now have this fear again of like, is there bias in this training data set? Is this going to perform as well as it did before? And so then you have to think about, am I going to try to build, you know, some sort of parallel A/B testing process where I can have, you know, one model in production and one, you know, scoring only 5% of our population. The real pain point of this is, and I've worked on models that sometimes you don't, you know, get a good sense of performance until 6 months later. So if I'm predicting, right, a customer will do something in 6 months, that means I have to wait 6 months just to see if this model is performing at a level that we think it is. And that's a really lengthy process. So that's why I think about, you know, when you think about all the changes and why that's such a scary process for me to go through, is because it can be so lengthy and it takes so many different touch points to implement.
Absolutely. All right, I think we have time for a couple of more. Here's an easy one. Can we get access to the full report? Yes, we will be publishing that on our website by the end of this month. So you will have access to all of that. We will be sending out the slides from today after the webinar. So you will have this kind of preview or this overall view of it, but we will be publishing that full report, like I said, in the next couple of weeks, and you will be able to download that from our website. All right, I think we can do one more. So what new technologies make you so excited for the future, or most excited for the future of machine learning? I can take it.
That one. Up to you.
I'll go first, I guess. I'm really excited about these technologies that are helping, just like we talked about, speed up the process so that we can start seeing value a lot faster. And I've mentioned several times, like, that's why I'm really excited to be here at Molecula. I think that, you know, our product FeatureBase is really a game changer in the AI ML space, and it's really exciting. Go to our website, check it out, request a demo if you want. But I think just making all of this easier and more accessible to companies that aren't, you know, Facebook or Google or Amazon, and really getting a lot more value out of it a lot faster.
Yeah, I definitely agree there. This is hard. There's so many cool space. I mean, there's really advanced algorithms. The kind of pre-canned models that you see with, you know, BERT in the NLP space and things like that are blowing up that I think are really cool. So I think we're going to see more and more of that. When you talk about what really excited me as a machine learning engineer is you know, model lifecycle streamlining. I think there is so much of that work that is repetitious in some form because it has to be. All the models at the end of the day are somewhat different, as well as the inputs that are feeding them. So I think anything that can help, you know, do 70% of that work to automate is really exciting for me to see. And I think tooling and just about all software right now is focusing on that. Specifically, like metadata capture. I can't tell you how many times I've set up logging of all the inputs to the model and the outputs, and setting up, you know, how are we going to evaluate the performance, because those are all different. But you know, automating that process would have freed up so much time on my plate and for other resources for us to do much cooler things. So I think that is a space I'm really excited about.
Definitely, really excited. All right, so thank you for joining us today. If we didn't get to your question, don't worry, we will follow up with you at the after the webinar's over, and we'll do that via email that you used to register. So look out for the full report on our website, and we will see you on our next webinar.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks.